Thanks for watching. My name is Glen Morgan, and this is We the Governed. So today we're going to be talking about something that I've actually received a number of emails and text messages and other messages from people out there asking about what the heck's going on in Washington State Governor Bob Ferguson's office, where he's having his legislative aides essentially quit just a few weeks into his first year as governor, particularly right in the middle of the leg session, 6 weeks from the end of the legislative session, and here his primary representatives are quitting, and of course it's made the news, and it's kind of a big story, and people are wondering what kind of chaos, what kind of problems are occurring here, and those are good questions to ask, and I want to get into the story a little bit because if you are Bob Ferguson right now, you're going to want to convince us that you've got everything under control. And I'm sure he wants us to believe this, that he can do everything. He's got everything under control. He's going to stop the floodwaters with Trump and with all the other drama going on back in D.C. And the last thing that Governor Ferguson wants you to believe is that he's got problems, as evidenced by staff basically bailing out and jumping ship. So this is kind of a big deal and a significant issue for Washington State, and I'll do my best to try to address it here right now. Now, before I get into those details, just want to encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to go down below, hit the like and subscribe button. It is important. It gives our channel a little bit more visibility if you do that. And also, feel free to share it with others. It does help if other people who may not see this video regularly, but you think they might be interested in it, if you can share it with them, that always helps get the message out there a little bit more. So let's get back to Bob Ferguson and this whole story about him losing his entire legislative team. Now, I don't want to put more stock in the story than it needs to have, but it is kind of significant. And let me explain why I think this is more significant than it had first appeared. Because sometimes you can have changes that happen. I mean, the main thing is around this Joyce Bruce, who was the main leg aide that Ferguson had, and her departure, and then another departure of another person that worked with her as representatives to from the governor's office to the legislature. It's kind of a big deal. And Ferguson, as has been represented and we've talked about briefly, especially in some of my live streams, he clearly is not super happy with what he's seen going on in the legislature. And more significantly, the legislature run by Democrats in both the House and the Senate, they aren't happy with Ferguson. In fact, they actually banned Ferguson's leg staff from having access to their caucus room meetings, which is unusual, and that hasn't happened in decades, and so it's kind of a big deal that it's happened right away under Ferguson's watch. And there's a number of reasons for that. Ferguson has indicated he's not so happy with the radical tax increases, some of the crazier policies that the Democrats have come out with, and the fact that the Democrats are not liking the fact that he's trying to find some budget cuts here and there, as limited as they might be, but even that little bit of a pushback from Ferguson's office seems to be generating a lot of pushback. And so there's this drama that is actually going on, and it's kind of more amazing because Ferguson's actually taken time to go meet with the Republicans, which Inslee never did. Now, what makes me interested a little bit more about the story than I was when I first heard about it is the fact that Yasmin Trudeau here, who's a Democrat legislator from the 27th, which is up in the Tacoma area, and by the way, just for clarity, she's not related to the former Prime Minister of Canada, despite the same last name, and so I think she'd want to make sure that I let you know that, because I don't think she would want to be related to him either. But she actually went public and in the paper and was quoted in multiple publications saying that, listen, there's a toxic workplace environment that's been created by Ferguson's chief of staff, David Webb. Now, that's not my words. This is hers. And she made a big deal about it. And it wasn't like an anonymous quote. This is her coming out under her own name and actually basically telling the papers this, and that this is part of the reason for this departure of these people from Ferguson's leg team. Why this is particularly significant is she's also actually a former employee of Bob Ferguson's when he worked at the AG's office. So this is somebody who worked in the AG's office, ran for the legislature, got elected in Tacoma, and now she's basically saying that Bob Ferguson's allowing a toxic workplace environment to happen under his chief of staff, David Webb, and that's why these other people are bailing out and leaving. And Ferguson, of course, is defending Webb because Webb has stuck with Ferguson through thick and thin, but it's creating an open partisan fight on the Democrat side between the legislature and the governor's office. And at least at this point in time, you have Yasmin here, who Representative Trudeau here, who's very open and willing to go public with her concerns and at least her views on what's going on behind the scenes. Now, anybody who actually knows Bob Ferguson knows that he probably doesn't appreciate that type of criticism. If he got this angry, and you can see his face here when there were a couple of Bob Fergusons running against him in the primary last year, then imagine how angry he is that he feels like he's getting stabbed in the back by the Democrats and being a lot of pushback going on right now with some of his policy ideas or proposals. And so he is not happy about this. So I would say that Legislator Trudeau, she should be watching her back, because Ferguson isn't going to forget, and he's going to be definitely making sure that she hears about it from him. Now, I think part of this, and the reason why it's going on right now, is because there's debate heating up, of course, over Bob Ferguson really just had, if you remember when he ran for governor, it was like he suddenly rediscovered public safety, something that he'd forgotten about his entire time while he was in the Attorney General's office. It's something he didn't care about at all. And suddenly he realized in order to become governor, with the increasing crime in Washington and the clear polls that showed that Washingtonians were worried about this increasing crime, he decided that he was going to reverse this defund the police attitude that the Democrats had had, especially in Seattle and elsewhere. And he was going to say, listen, I'm going to put more money in as governor to hire more police in Washington state. And that has been rejected by the Democrats in both houses of the legislature. They don't like that idea. And so this has created a conflict between a promise, even if he wasn't super serious about it, one of the few promises he made that wasn't openly hostile to the future of Washington state. And that promise has created some tension between him and the Democrats that are in charge of both houses right now. On top of that, because he did dare to propose very timid and mild budget cuts, even a furlough program, the unions, who essentially were the main backbone of the Ferguson campaign, helping him get elected, they feel, and this is their quote, right, personally betrayed, because he has this furlough plan where he's trying to cut the budget and reduce it. I mean, remember one thing that Ferguson, and to be fair, this isn't something that he decided, it was an Inslee negotiated deal that Inslee jacked up the pay for a lot of public workers by about $4 billion impact in the budget. And that's why you had the Republicans come out in the state Senate and provide an alternative budget that simply says we need to relook at that and revisit it, because it was too rich of a pay raise for no apparent return to the people who live in the state of Washington and actually have to pay for it. So regardless, Bob Ferguson isn't new at doing that specifically. Instead, what he's just saying is that he'll have this minor kind of tepid furlough program, and of course any pushback at all is a pushback too much, and so the unions are mad and they're pushing back on Bob Ferguson right now. This is kind of what's going on behind the scenes, and in order to set that in context and I think better understand some of the stuff that does happen, I did an article here and a video from a few years ago that basically talked about the top 6 government bureaucrat games that they play when they're faced with budget cuts. And as minor as these budget cuts might be in Washington, considering how much the budget has increased consistently over the past many years, let's talk about these games, because you're going to understand when you see how the games work, you're going to understand, I think, better where we are in this process. Now, the first game they always play is denial, and we're past this stage now. Denial is usually what they first say when they can see the handwriting on the wall and budgets are going to have to be cut because they can't get enough more money. The first thing they decide is that's not true, and they have plenty of money to deal with. We're past that. The next step they usually do is they say, let's go use other people's money. Usually that is federal money, or it's increasing taxes. It's kind of one or the other, but as long as they can find some way of getting more money from another source, then that allows them to paper over the problems that have put them in a situation where budget cuts are probably necessary. That's how they got out of COVID, was simply flooding the zone with trillions of federal dollars, and our state was right there at the feeding trough along with everybody else. Apparently, so were the Nigerian fraudsters who stole $600 million from our unemployment security department, but that's a story for another time. Then, of course, what they try to do, if they can, is to kick the can on the cost down the road and live high today and make our children pay for it tomorrow. This is what happens every time they get debt, and you'll see school districts do this with capital when they try to build a new building, and they bloat the cost of that, and they spread it out over the next 30 years. So the kids that are still in school and can't read and write, when they graduate, they'll have to pay that bill when they decide to try to get a house. The next step is usually punishing taxpayers. See if you can find some way to increase taxes. It's another classic game that they usually play. Unfortunately, I think for Bob Ferguson and the Democrats in this current cycle, we've already done that quite a bit. Taxes on the property taxes have been raised quite high. You see sales tax probably about as high as they can get it. You see the effort with the CCA to jack up gas taxes in kind of a backdoor way. That's a Climate Commitment Act scam that's increasing the cost of every gallon of fuel that you buy by about 40 cents or so. They've already been punishing taxpayers for quite a while in Washington. There's not a lot more room to go there. Ferguson recognizes this just from a pure political standpoint, and even though the Democrats in the legislature are in denial, it should be worth noting that most of their tax proposals have already died, the significant ones. So the next step, of course, is then across the board tax or budget cuts, essentially. Now, this is a lazy way of cutting the expenses of government. What it means is that you're not going to bother to dig into government and actually assess where policies are doing well or where money's being wasted. You just simply say, everybody takes a cut, and then you don't have to pick sides. Now, Ferguson's doing that right now with some exceptions. He kind of had this kind of sloppy across-the-board cut. You saw Governor Gregoire do this back in the day when she was in office too. This is kind of the lazy way, and we're already there. This is happening right now, which basically creates, I think, the environment that we see today in Washington, and what you may be seeing some evidence with these departures and then public statements and pushback. This creates the modern equivalent of the Hunger Games in government. One bureaucracy or special interest is going to view another one as now a threat, and instead of allies in looting the taxpayer dollars, they have to basically stab each other in the back and try to grab some of the money, or as much money as they can, for themselves. And I think that's what you're seeing reflected in both the departure of some of these employees, but more importantly, this battle behind the scenes. This is the kind of thing that happens when things aren't going well and there's some people who feel left out on it. Now, I've had some interaction with senior employees who work in the governor's office in the past. Now, this is from a number of years ago, but I was involved in exposing a bunch of emails from Governor Inslee. It was Ted Sturtevant at the time, who's the former director of ecology, when he had sent emails, and I got these in a public records request, and he had sent them to other people within the Department of Ecology, calling Republicans a word that sounds like truckers but starts with F. Now, what this led to was I filed then a records request because Ted Sturtevant was working as the senior legislative policy advisor for Inslee at the time. This is about 11 years ago now. And I had filed a request with the governor's office about this guy on any other emails that were profanity-laced that he had sent out, or text messages that he'd sent out when he worked for Governor Inslee. Now, they rapidly, a couple weeks after I filed that records request, one of the weirdest records requests I've ever filed, actually, this guy resigned. And he announced his resignation, and in his resignation letter that he sent to the legislature, he was substantially complaining about the Public Records Act and how unfair it really was. And he wasn't happy, and he was gone. Now, the governor's office at the time probably lied, and they said that they couldn't find anything in the emails that were responsive to the records request I sent. But despite that, this guy still was forced to bail out, and he left. And that's the kind of thing that you see resulting from exposing the truth, sometimes about these staffers, because they don't have the same level of protection that the elected officials do. And so this is sometimes some of the drama that goes on behind the scenes. Now, I'm not aware of something like that specifically happening in this case, but there's all kinds of reasons that you can see staffers getting involved in these fights. Because if there's one thing government bureaucracy does really well, and the politicians involved are oftentimes involved in this as well, it's the backstabbing Olympics. When times are tough, or people feel left out, or they want their piece of the pie, there's a lot of different personal reasons that they're going to start stabbing each other in the back and creating drama. And you see this especially when people are willing to go public with what's going on. Now, listen, I'm not sure that exactly all the details behind the scenes. We're only seeing little bits and pieces coming out right now. But when senior staffers like this do quit, that doesn't mean things are going well behind the scenes in Governor Ferguson's Olympia today. And we'll see how the drama kind of plays out in the last 6 weeks of the legislative session. It is worth paying attention to what's happening here. We'll keep you posted if we find out anything more. But the one thing I do have to say is I believe that a lot of the pressure that many people watching this video and many people around Washington State have been involved in responding and get involved and commenting on these bills, I think you've made a big difference. And it's part of showing up. It's part of being involved and engaged and making a difference in our state, even if it feels like all hope is lost and we have crazies in charge. These things usually come to an end, and there's a wave in every political cycle, and usually the pendulum swings back at some point in time. But right now, the pressure that you're putting on the legislature is making a difference because you're showing up. As I always say, showing up makes a big difference, and the future belongs to those who show up.